Hi, welcome to today's video. My name's Paul. So this week, as you can see, is watercolor landscape painting. And this sort of follows on from last week's charcoal landscape drawing. In last week's video, I sort of left quite a bit of white paper, and I said it was something I wanted to try out more with the watercolor landscape painting. So that's one of the goals of this week's painting. So what I'm going to do is, while you're watching me doing the painting, I'm just going to try and describe what I'm doing and some of the thinking behind what I'm doing. So like all of my paintings, I always start with the sky and I paint that wet in wet. Now there's no sort of mystical, magical reason for starting with the sky. It's just purely practical. As you can see, I paint the sky wet in wet, and you can see the water and the pigment running down the paper. If I was to paint the bottom half of the paper, the foreground first, it would get ruined with all of that water and pigment that's running down. So it's just a simple practical reason for starting with the sky. I always do the skies, well, usually I do the skies wet in wet. And the reason for that is I want soft edges. So if you're new to watercolor painting, a kind of general rule of thumb is if the paper is wet, and you could see at the beginning I used a little spray bottle to soak the paper. If the paper's wet, when you put the paint, the pigment onto the paper, it'll spread out a little bit. Exactly how much it spreads out sort of depends on the paper, how wet the paper is, how wet the brush is, the paint you're using. There's lots of different factors into how much it spreads out. Basically, a short way of saying it is you don't have complete control when you're using wet in wet. If you put wet paint onto dry paper, it tends not to spread out as much, so you'll end up with harder edges. It's a general sort of rule of thumb. It's the kind of thing that when you're getting started with watercolor painting that you want to experiment with and try out, just to see the different results that you can get. But like I said, in this painting I wanted soft edges, so I did wet in wet. And I should say that it's not that soft edges is the correct way of doing it, it's just a choice I made. The way I look at art is, it's not this is what you have to do, these are the rules. I reject that way of painting completely. Instead, I think of it as a series of choices that you make. Do I want hard edges? Do I want soft edges? So on and so on. The next step for me when I'm painting is always to put in this sort of horizon line, this dark blue line, which I see as sort of distant hedges and trees. But it also serves some other functions in the painting. It's part of I see it as kind of the sort of composition or the skeleton of the painting. And then everything else, like hills and trees, clouds, grass and so on, that's just sort of fleshing out that sort of the bones of the painting, the sort of skeleton of the painting. And this, if you like, skeleton of the painting has two parts. There's the horizon line I put in, and there's also this other blue hedgerow that I'm doing at the moment. And this other hedgerow links the background, the middle ground and the foreground. And because it sort of tapers into the background, it gives that sort of linear perspective, it gives the painting a feeling of depth a little bit. Some of the other things I do to give a sense of depth, you can see me scratching on the paper there, and that creates lines that some people will read as grass and things growing up. Putting that sort of detail into the foreground separates the foreground from the middle ground and the background. The middle ground and background don't have those sort of details. So by separating out the foreground, again, it kind of helps to give the painting a feeling of depth. Some of the other things I'll do, as well as scratching the paper, you'll see me, I also use some dry brush marks to get that feeling of grass and vegetation and things. This is the first paint that isn't blue that I put on the paper. It's a light cadmium yellow. That's a Sennelier. That's the Sennelier name for the color. Different brands have different names for colors. Where that mixes with the blue paint, you're going to get greens forming. And again, it's somewhat chaotic because you're doing the mixing on the paper, so you don't really know what green you get until you get the green, sort of thing. But I don't mind that sort of slightly anarchic way of painting. I know some people prefer to be in complete control all the time, so they prefer probably to do the mixing on the palette and then put it onto the paper. Some of the other things I'm doing, the dabbing the yellow onto that hedgerow again, that just adds in more a feeling of sort of detail in the foreground. And then this is the dry brush just on the foreground as well. This is almost the final painting. And you can see there is quite a bit of white paper left. I know that not everybody's going to like that sort of look, but again, one of the ideas that I have about painting is I'm sort of painting for myself, not for anybody else. What I mean is, that maybe sounds arrogant or selfish, it's not meant to be, it's just, I think to grow as an artist, as a painter, you kind of have to do your own thing. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. But if you're trying to please other people all the time, you're trying to produce art that you think other people will like, I don't think it's maybe you can't grow as much as an artist if you're doing that. Maybe controversial, but that's my feeling about that. So I'm not really worried whether other people like this sort of painting. I like it, and it's something that I want to explore more. I like the sort of loose, somewhat unfinished feeling that you have with the painting, leaving those sort of the white paper showing through in places. And you can sort of see now in this scan of the final painting that on the left hand side, that sort of distant hillside that's sloping down towards the center of the page, you can see that soft edge where it meets the sky. So again, that's that wet in wet technique. Okay, well, if you made it this far in the video, thank you for watching, and hopefully see you in next week's video.